We have begun. All right. Retrospectively, let's at the start of lab. I can talk now. At the start of lab, we can sort of meander our way through looking at these exams, if you don't mind. So, and that'll be fine. Alyssa's going to be got to take her cat to the vet. I feel that that's an important reason for me. That's all right. It's my the cats are having a day of themselves because the dog is at CBW. Can't bow out. He's woofing it up. We're very suspicious because he always comes home smelling kind of urine, golden showers. He's kinky. Well, I don't know. He keeps licking our toes. We think we don't know what goes on there. I think it's very questionable. We really think that he's disturbed. Maybe I told you one. Go back. Oh, I'll get to that story another time. It's too much fun. It's off color, but then so am I. All right, let's begin. So I appreciate your indulgence for Friday. By the time there's so much going on at home, we're unable to do much. One of the few days my wife is at home. She's back with her mom today. We shall see. No, we're not talking about anything that occurred Sunday whatsoever. The only good news Sunday, and it was a struggle, is my two teams for the suicide pool, Kansas City and Philadelphia, pulled it out.
That Chiefs game last night.
Oh, it's ridiculous. What do they do? I give up, but I digress. On with the show. So, ladies and gentlemen, mesdames and messieurs, mine Helen and mine hair, the opening from Cabaret, Joel Grey, brilliant. So, this is we're going to talk a bit about some of the really interesting areas in the cerebral cortex that are. This is just a fascinating area, the whole idea of the brain. And what we'll do muscles begrudgingly in lab. And you'll have the bones to look at, so we'll have some additional free time in the lab if you like. And because I anticipate we're going to do the bones practical next week. So, and I'll give you a heads up on what's going on with that. But then after that, we'll probably be dissecting a brain. I have to check with Mrs. Maurer as to when our specimens, they may even be in as far as I know. So here we go. So the cerebral cortex, and really the frontal lobe is probably the centerpiece of all of this. All of the things that have happened in the cerebral lobes, and particularly the cortices, is where everything occurs. We think, we're aware, we hear, we initiate communication, we process information, we understand stuff. Even though it's a very, very limited amount of gray matter that's there. There's an immense amount of connections. And there's immense, when we get to the white matter, you're going to see there's an immense amount of transiting of information from point A to point B to point C, etc. That's all this elaborate, and you're the poster children for all of this because you're in an educational environment, and you really are optimizing your capacity there, so to speak. So take a look. These are, and they'll use PET as positron emission, technology, and MRI is a different. And MRI is an interesting technology in and of itself. So positrons, basically what they do is they label glucose with positrons. Brain only works on glucose. So we look for areas where there's intense amount of glucose activity. That tells us what parts of the brain are doing it. And they look at these particular domains. So here's a functional MRI working roughly the same way. When we see things occipital lobe, when we hear things temporal lobe. This is an interesting area, and there's two areas we're going to look at today that are part of this sort of interesting combination. One is called Broca's, and you'll need to know these. And Broca's is motor activity, and Wernicke's, which you're going to see in a different location, is sensory activity. And these are areas, particularly Broca's, that are affected, particularly when someone has had a stroke. And stroke is very, very common. There's a lot of events. A stroke is also known as a cerebrovascular accident, or CVA, is when there is a limited amount of blood supply to the brain with regard to the knee. And it causes Here's what a stroke is: brain cells to die. This is not, oh, grandma had a mini stroke and she's okay. If you had a stroke, there's damage. Whether or not the damage is something that is evident or testable or reportable is different. But what we see a lot, and the term for this is called aphasia. And so a stroke patient they'll be able to understand, oh, what day is it today? And we all know it's Monday, but they won't be able to get the word out. That's because their ability to communicate. And we're not just talking about, well, here's paper and pencil, you can write it. Communicating is impaired. So it's extraordinarily frustrating. It's part of the rehabilitation process. Wernicke's is a sensory area. It's affected less frequently. But where we do see it is that someone will actually be anticipating, because they can't really understand what you're saying. You'll be talking to them, and you'll be going, what a lovely day it is, and they'll be saying, yes, it's Monday. So they'll give you a perfectly grammatically correct answer, but that has nothing to do with the question. There's a lot of interesting nuances we see with regard to that. And as you can see, thinking all over the place. So we look at motor areas, sensory areas, and what we have probably the largest amount of are association areas. It's one thing to direct movement. It's another thing to be aware of some sensory input. How we integrate it and utilize it and respond to it is really what your brain is about. So again, it's contralateral for the most part. There are some areas that are on the same sided. They're a little bit more limited, but again, it's an important term. Contralateral, right side of my brain, making my left arm move. Other way around. So that's not, and again, the term IPSI, I-P-S-I, lateral, when we get to the cerebellum, that's all about motor coordination on the same side. Because when you pick up whatever you're using as an implement to write or do something and type on a keyboard, that whole idea is a lot of it's not just as simple as picking it up. There's a whole lot of other motor activities that go along with it. How well do I grip it? What muscles do I use to lift my arm? How do I arrange my writing implement? Or how am I going to use my fingers? What letters am I going to pick? All of that coordination is on the same side. That's where the cerebellum comes in. So we do that. So conscious behavior involves one cortex. So motorly rather, we look at the frontal lobe, which is really the highest order of functioning. So you have the primary motor cortex, and if you got a chance to listen to what I presented on Friday, there is a central sulcus roughly here, underlying roughly where that coronal suture is. We won't be able to see it so well on the sheet, but the lobe directly anterior to that gyrus is known as the primary motor cortex. Now, if we go one more gyrus anteriorly, that's the premotor cortex. So that's sort of preparing for the instructions. The instructions to move what and how come from the motor cortex. How that plan of attack is sort of plotted out, premotor cortex. There's Broca's area is more inferior. And then we get, even now we're going more anterior of the frontal eye fields, because we do a lot of how we respond to things comes from our visual input for those who are able to see. Again, it's a little bit different. If you watch that Marvel series with the guy who lost his sight, what was the name of that guy? What?
Daredevil.
Yeah, Daredevil. You saw when he got in, and Scott Glenn, who was playing like the mentor, was how to use all of your senses. That was a pretty good series. It wasn't Jessica Jones, but what is? See, I have some more modern cultural inputs. It's not all Adam West as the original Batman. Holy Swiss cheese, Batman. But they had great villains. Absolutely. Just stop. They don't even know what you're talking about. Ignore it. So here we have Broca's. You see that's frontal lobe, and it's much more assertive on the left. Some of us think it may only be on the left. I think there's a little bit on the right. And this is the Wernicke's outline. And you'll see this a lot. Here's the central sulcus. Here's the primary motor cortex, or primary motor gyrus, if you will. And here's the premotor one. As we go more advanced, the frontal eye fields, and then we get into this very interesting area called the anterior association area, or the prefrontal cortex, working memory, task management, recall, multiple problems, which some of you, based on the exam, will need to do a little work on. Just saying. They don't think you're funny. Okay, and vision, this is where it finally lands, and then everything else from when we get the visual inputs is all about processing it. And here again, you can see Wernicke's. This is called the lateral sulcus, and it's sort of the inherent divide that basically occurs almost. And if we pull this away, you would see the extent of the frontal, the extent of the parietal, and then this temporal area, and down here is the cerebellum. So, precentral gyrus. These are called pyramidal cells. I commented on a little bit. Pyramidal cells are the primary way we direct. It's called the lateral corticospinal tract. It's your brain telling my hand to move like that. Okay. So we have now, to do it smoothly and effortlessly requires a lot more input. And then you're going to hear the term extrapyramidal symptoms, particularly if you go into a medical field. One of the side effects of medications is we will see people get kind of shakes or jittery. Okay, those are called extrapyramidal symptoms. A lot of medications produce this as a side effect, and that's affecting other motor passageways that don't allow it to be quite a smooth transition. It's almost Parkinson's-like, and Parkinson's is a very complicated discussion. So the pyramidal tracts, as you can see, are the corticospinal, principally what's called the lateral corticospinal. When we look at tracts, we'll go over those. Long axons that basically send the impulse down to the spinal cord. Okay? And then from the spinal cord, you have another series of passageways that tell the muscle what to do. It's a two-nerve circuit. You'll learn in this unit they're called upper and lower motor neurons. Upper neurons, brain, roughly the spinal cord, sometimes to the brain stem. The lower motor neuron from the brainstem or the spinal cord out to the specific muscle that are there. There's an interesting disease that just took the life of a coach for one of the hockey teams called amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease, which was the first most notable person who succumbed to that disease relatively early. And that is a disease that affects both upper and lower motor neurons. A very tragic disease, because your mind works perfectly, but your muscles no longer work. You're of an age where a lot of high schools had you read a wonderful book, maybe yours did as well, called Tuesdays with Maury. Because it was almost, for my kids in high school, and you guys are obviously a little bit younger, that was something that was a book that was written for Maury Schwartz up at Brandeis University, where a very famous sports guy named Mitch Albom, who was, if you're a sports person like I was, in the sense of writers and reporters, that's where you learned about Mitch. So he's out of Detroit. And had some wonderful books about that were there. And we all talked about how eventually he succumbed. It was a very good movie. And the late Jack Lemmon was played Maury Schwartz in that particular movie. So we can map this out, and these are great. They're called homunculi. I love it. Upside down characters, contralateral motor innervation. And we have sensory ones and motor ones. And you can see our way we interact with the world is facially speaking, upper extremity, a little bit lower extremity, and the way we sense the world. Kind of the same way, as you can see. So you get an idea how little sensory input we get from your stomach and your small and large intestines. That's why it's so hard when somebody tells you you have a stomach ache. Someone will say, well, it's all over. You ask the next 10 people, where's it hurt? Here, 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 here. Because you can't localize it. Now, if a bug lands on your hand or your arm, you know exactly where that is. You get a splinter. That's all about the degree of sensory. The premotor cortex staging area. Learned, repetitious. So this is another aspect of muscle memory that's important. muscle memory, in any activity. It doesn't have to be. Again, I make the comment all the time that you when you're walking here from wherever your last class was, or if you came from wherever you were coming on to here, you didn't say, okay, I do this because I'm old. Get up, Lou. Okay, move your left. Don't smile at me. It's not funny. My wife keeps wondering why she married this old guy. Move your right leg and now swing your left leg and put your foot. You don't do that. Even I don't do that. It's automatic. You're on automatic pilot. Okay, I gotta go. I gotta go up to 263. Right? We all do that. So simultaneous or sequential actions, if you will. Broca's area. I don't necessarily agree that it's only in it dominates if you're a left side dominant, and we'll get into that a little bit. Directs muscles of speech, but it's not just speech. As I said, in the frontal eye field, voluntary, you're looking around, you want to see something, you're responding to something, you're moving around. You see a lot of that illustration. Here is sort of the medial view of just the cortex itself. We're not looking at the brain stem. So this is a very unique view that you'll be able to see when we do the brain dissection because it looks the same. So you're going to see, for instance, the olfactory bulb, the first cranial nerve, the only cranial nerve that goes directly into the cerebral area. This very, very wide, thick band of white matter called the corpus callosum, which literally means hard body. Okay? And you're going to slice right through it to see this view. You're going to see the continuation of structures that are located within this sort of, it's almost like you sliced it this way and opened it up, and you're looking at that side. So that medial area plays a pivotal role, particularly in emotions, because that's where we see the limbic system. And the limbic system is really sort of almost like your emotional heartbeat. So smell plays a role. This area called the fornix plays a role. Here's the primary olfactory cortex. This is actually where you smell. That's part of it as well. This area, this gyrus on the interior is called the cingulate because it looks like the letter C. That plays a role in emotions, and we'll get to a lot of these as we move on. So it's a very interesting view that you'll be able to look at. So primary motor cortex, stroke, paralysis occurs obviously on the opposite side. So you'll see some of the left side stroke, you'll see afterwards classically what happens, it's an upper motor neuron lesion, and how that manifests itself during healing is it sends accelerated signals to muscles, and you get flexion contractures, so they walk like this type. And we have to brace people this way, and we have to brace them in their leg to avoid those contractions. Flexors always, when you stimulate muscles equally, flexors are always going to overpower extensors. So we see flexion contractions, and you have to guard against that rehabilitatively. And I have a fair amount of experience in that realm as well. So as you can see, only control is lost. So the premotor area would allow the fingers to move, but we don't really have the same degree of control. We can reprogram them with practice, and this is really what rehabilitation is about. So they're coming to a few more sensory areas. Conscious awareness of sensation, and there's a bunch. Somatosensory, sensing the body, associating it again. The cortex directly, the gyrus directly posterior to the central sulcus, primary body sensory cortex. Then what does that tell us? Then we associated visual in the occipital area, auditory in the temporal area, as well as vestibular balance, deeper olfactory and gustatory for taste, visceral sensations. So this receives a lot of information, that post-central gyrus, as to what's going on, body position, signals from all over. We can determine where it is very specifically for the most part. And you saw the homunculus before, and they'll just show it to you again. We associate, integrate that information, size, texture, all of those types of things. So we may sense something landed. How do we know it's a bug? How do we know it may not just be something that's irritated? Maybe you struck it against something, those kinds of things. In the visual area, extreme tip is the primary visual. It's the area is underneath something called the calcarine sulcus. It's directly getting the information sensory from the retina. And then it's surrounded by these association areas. And that's how we learn. We see something repetitively. So when you're little, they'll say, okay, this is a cat and this is a dog. And all the things that when the little kids do, or if you work with little kids, all those repetitive things that are there, the colors, etc. Being able to recognize faces, which I obviously don't. And then auditory cortex, temporal lobes, and then associating it with all the different sounds. So how many of you, we all can do it, you hear something musical that you remember acutely, or a song or something that you really like, and you hear it, and it'll come back to you. Sort of in the early Name That Tune, that's an old game show. That used to be popular. And then, and also again, in and around the cortical areas, this is for balance, head position in space, olfactory is smell, temporal lobes in that medial aspect, very, very primitive, okay? And you'll see that that plays a big deal. Emotions, smells trigger a lot of, it's like smelling a skunk. It's kind of like, ugh, like that. And my kids hated me growing up. Because if they were, oh, Dad, I got to throw up. It's like, here's a plastic bag. Tell me when you're done. I was that big. Because I get sick too. What a terrible, you were an awful parent, Dad. Yes, I was. Taste, visceral sensation, etc., etc. So you saw those illustrations before. So individuals with damaged visual association areas can see, but they don't really understand what they're looking at. So this is one of the things that where we can try to isolate certain areas of brain damage or concussion. They begin to, so there's a lot about them. Now these are area, multimodal association areas, meaning to the information, and that's what it is. Okay, previous experiences. So you're going to see these three major areas that we see that we call multimodal. Sensations, thoughts, emotions become conscious. And really it's kind of what is our individual personalities that are there. So you have an area, anterior association, posterior association, and limbic association, which is more emotional. The anterior area is really interesting. It's such a misunderstood area. The prefrontal cortex, intellect, cognition, recall, personality, working memory, all of these things, feedback from a social environment. So you can see if you're acting a particular way and people are looking at you strangely, you probably modify your activity. Most of us would. This was the area that they thought controlled aberrant behavior. And this is what they used to do. They did a thing called a prefrontal lobotomy. They would remove that lobe. The best illustration in one of the all-time great movies, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. If you haven't seen it, you should see it. It's easy to find. I'm sure you can watch it for free on Tubi or Plex or wherever it is. If you don't have one of the, all the different movie apps that are there. That one, it was sort of like, we're going to win the Academy Award for Best Picture, Best Actor. The late Louise Fletcher for Best Actress. That was the very famous Nurse Ratched. It was a stage play. That movie was put, interestingly, the actor Michael Douglas sort of bought that. The thing, he really had a gift for those kinds of things. And so they're just brilliant in that. And the supporting actors in that, Brad Dourif, who, if you don't know, is just this very sort of quirky Southern actor who played Billy. That was the first time we saw Danny DeVito. Okay. The guy from all the Back to the Future movies, Lloyd, first name, help me. You're killing me. You're terrible. I'm not going to talk to you. Okay, goodbye. I don't even want to, I don't. Why do I come here? Back to the future. Not future, but future. Who was it? Oh, you're killing me. Ah, ah, Christopher Lloyd. That was the first time we saw him, okay, in the movies, even though they were around the New York acting scene for quite a while. So there were a lot of very interesting people who played sort of people who were part of this insane asylum, for lack of a better term, that they took where Jack Nicholson came and eventually. So if you saw the movie, you're going to see why that was done back in the 50s and how it just destroyed people that were there. The posterior association is more sensory, recognizing patterns and faces, understanding written and spoken language. That's the Wernicke's area that I was telling you about that are part of it. And now limbic, and these are important areas, that cingulate gyrus on the medial portion surrounding the corpus callosum, the hippocampus and parahippocampal gyrus, which are associated with the temporal lobe. It's emotions. If you're like most people, when you do something wrong, it cements it. If you're on a job site and all of a sudden we learn from, it's the old saying, we learn from our mistakes, and particularly those that affect us, that are there. And that's really where part of this is. And a lot of people, to me, that limbic system is so interesting. There's an area called the amygdala, that's your rage center. The hippocampus has a lot to do with memories, both short and long-term memories. We see those areas on MRI and functional MRIs and PTs, and it allows us now to diagnose Alzheimer's disease and the variations of it. Because years ago, we could only diagnose it post-mortem. Now we have the technology to basically see it, other than being able to see it based on the clinical presentation. But now there's more diagnostic criteria that we can bring to the party, so to speak. So tumors, certainly mental and personality, it affects a lot of people. Posterior, side of the body. I mean, there's some really oddball things if you read through these. So those are all very interesting things. And our understanding has really improved. So we realize now when we came to criminal behavior, when they used to lobotomize people, now we've got a whole array of different techniques that are more able to deal, not always successfully. Some very interesting ideas. There was a really good series that they just found too expensive to reproduce on Netflix. It was Mind Hunters. Ran for a couple of years, and they dealt with serial killers, and they really looked a lot like the serial killers that are still around. That you're trying to understand the mindset that was there, and this is the idea of lateralization. So most of us left side dominant, right-handedness somewhat predominates. And so we see that. And so I'm the most left hemisphere dominant language, math, logic. That's me in a nutshell. My visual spatial skills, my children could beat me playing the early days of Nintendo Super Mario when they were like 5 and 6 years old. I have no ability. Okay, artistic and musical skills, very limited. You've seen the way I draw. Stick figures. That's my artistic. I am as left side dominant as possible. But we're constantly being able to communicate those areas that are there. So we'll continue on with this show. I've got to use myself because who else do I understand better? You're stuck with me. I can't help it. So white matter, communications channels, 3 types. Okay, commissural fibers, they are left and right side. Even though I'm left side dominant, we're constantly communicating that information to the right side. That's that corpus callosum. That's the continual tracking between both sides. Association fibers are bringing the material along the same side for processing. And then projection fibers either go up or go down, either bringing up the message or sending down the message. as you will see. So these are large, and the word we use is tracts, Tracts, as opposed to Ks. Association fibers, same hemisphere, connect different parts. Commissural, horizontal fibers, gray matter between the two hemispheres. Projection, okay? There's something called the internal capsule on the same fibers on each side of the brain that pass between the thalamus and some of the basal nuclei. You're going to see when we get to the basal nuclei shortly the role that they play in motor coordination and motor activities. And most famously, and something you can see on the sheep brain dissection, is called the corona radiatum. So we're familiar with the term corona, it means crown. So coronaviruses got their name because the envelope looked like a crown. Electron microscopically, that's how they got the name coronaviruses. It's not the only time. So radiating crown is something that came from the thalamus of a band of white fibers. And basically what the thalamus, when we get to it, does is it basically directs sensation to the appropriate area. It shuttles visual to the occipital lobe, auditory to the temporal lobe, somatosensory to the parietal lobe. That's its job. And you'll see they have them there isolated. So this is what we look like if we take a slice of the brain. This is all white matter. Here's the corpus callosum, basically involved in the area just below the ventricles that we had talked about previously. Now you can begin to see some of those fibers that are there. The corona radiata would come from this thalamic area and move in various directions. Association fibers would go from here and bring the signals to here or to here on the same side. And then the projection fibers would go up and down. And what we see a lot of them, and what they do is their fancy word is decussate. It means crossing over, but in anatomical science, they decussate. Where do they decussate? Mostly in here in the medulla oblongata. And that those two mounds that you'll see in the medulla, when we look at that, that's where the term pyramids come from, because they were pyramidally shaped, at least to the anatomist. So just say, so there's a lot that's there. So here you can see them perhaps a little bit better, the corona radiata and the internal capsule. So the corona radiata is kind of like this area. We see a lot of those fibers. You can see the internal capsule that's there. And basically it's just sort of like directing traffic. And you'll get to take a look at that. So this is one of the things that you can see. It's almost like this sort of seashell shape kind of view that you can see both associated with the corona radiata and this internal capsule. So you can see that on the sheep brain. If you it's almost like you can lift the cerebral cortex up and look at that thalamic area and actually see that structure. Okay. The third of these regions that are associated with the cerebral area, other than gray matter and white matter, are islands of gray matter called the basal nuclei. Previously, we called them a ganglia. When we saw islands of gray matter now, by convention in the brain, we call them nuclei, because we don't use the term nucleus for the cell body. We use cell bodies for individual nuclei of brain cells, where ganglia is a term that we now use for islands of gray matter that are outside of, they're in the peripheral nervous system. We'll look at those relatively shortly. Collectively, they have, and you'll see them, and you can actually see them on the dissection when you sort of look inside the ventricle. You can see these masses of gray matter. Collectively, we often call them the corpus striatum because they have a striped appearance. And what I commented on was they were associated with a lot of significant features, particularly pathways that were coming from the midbrain where neurotransmitters were produced. The most famous of these comes from what's called the substantia nigra, which means black stuff. Okay, in the midbrain where it makes a lot of neurotransmitters, and they go to the corpus striatum, so they're called the nigra striatal dopamine pathway. That is the major pathway that is associated with classic Parkinson's disease. It typically is associated with a lack of or an insufficient amount of the neurotransmitter dopamine. Well, dopamine does not cross the blood-brain barrier chemically So we use a precursor substance, which we do a lot, called L-dopa. And it was interesting. There was another movie that wasn't nearly as good as One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, called Awakenings, which starred the late Robin Williams, and Robert De Niro played the guy that they were, to use the word, experimenting on. And also in that movie was Julie Kavner, who forever has played the voice of Marge Simpson. Just saying. And in that movie, Robin Williams was experimenting with amounts of L-dopa to try to get patients who had a certain degree of catatonia to kind of come back. And that was where Robert De Niro sort of played a role that was involved in that, because he was the patient. And so and that area is where we use, and it's still used today, in an effort to try to get folks who have Parkinson's, and Parkinson's, really, to sort of give it a broad look, is a movement disorder. When my brain says, move, grab this or grab that or answer my phone, it's calling, thankfully, is a gross movement. What your basal ganglia do is that's fine motor control. How rapidly I do it, how slowly, how fastly. Do I do it smooth and effortlessly, or is that herky-jerky stuff? That's Parkinson's when you see it. Hard to stop. There's a lot of things that can do it. Brain damage, repetitive brain damage. Boxers got it. Most famously, Muhammad Ali, greatest boxer I ever saw. I know. You're into the mixed martial arts and stuff. No. Sweet science, boxing, baby. I know. I'm of an age. The three biggest sports in the 50s and 60s: baseball, horse racing, boxing. Football was in its infancy. Just saying. I said it already today. The first game I went to was the Giants versus the Steelers in the old Yankee Stadium in 1960, 9 years old. Remember it to this day, as I do everything just about, other than your names. And this is still the only one I know. She's ignored me. Hey, how are you doing?
I'm good, Simon.
What's up? What are you watching on TV?
I'm not. I was doing the Wordle.
Whatever that is.
Yeah.
Your Wordle of the day.
Yeah. I got it though. Don't worry.
Good. You're special.
Thank you.
Not necessarily short bus special, but special.
Oh, no, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. Oh, yeah.
I didn't mean to be offensive. You can't use the R word anymore.
Yeah, that's bad.
That's very bad.
Don't use that word.
You can't say anything today. I can't even talk about certain tales we used to sell kids, F tales, fairy tales. It's pejorative. Do you know what I mean? You can't say that. People will have the wrong view of that. I've been telling you forever. The whole, Goldilocks, bears, too hot, too cold, just right. What is that today? Home invasion. Trashes the kids, trashes the bear's house, eats their food, breaks up the furniture. Everybody. How about really? It is hysterical. She did it. Sleeping in their beds. Who knows what she's doing?
Must not been in America because, our gun laws.
Exactly. You're right. Absolutely right. How about Snow White? But she's hanging out with 7 little guys in the woods. What is going on?
That's accurate.
It's really suspicious. I wonder.
You're on something.
I'm telling you, it's good. Yeah, who knows? Oh, it's okay. I don't want to live in the palace anymore. I'm going to live in the woods with 7 pejorative terms, little people, because you don't want to say dwarves. And who's Doc? What is he up to there? I wonder about that. You're telling me, like, not like a duck quack. See, that's the way I look at things. I have a perverse view of the universe. Speaking of perverse views, here are the basal nuclei. So it's a, I know. So they have fancy names you don't have to know, like the putamen and the caudate nucleus. But when you do slices, it looked like stripes. So we collectively there's a lot of terms. And if you're going on, so muscle movements, cognition and emotion, people with Parkinson's tend to have a what they call a flat affect. So they kind of like, they're there. I have that effect on students as well when I'm bored. Not you. Look, I'm privileged that you'll put up with my shtick, so to speak. So regulate intensity. This is that slow stereotype movement. And you'll see that it's hard to start or stop, inappropriate responses. And so Parkinson's disease and very famously Huntington's disease is another version of this. Because my wife asked me, we were talking about the hockey coach with ALS. And she said, isn't that about the same as Huntington's disease? I said, not really. Huntington's disease, for you genetics fans, is what? What kind of a disease is it? How does it classify genetically? What? It's what kind of dominant? Autosomal dominant. You guys are on your game. What does that mean? If one parent has it, there's a 50-50 chance the offspring will get it. Most famously, a guy named Woody Guthrie, who was a very famous folk singer. We happened to just watch Walk the Line with, the movie about Johnny Cash. It was great. And Woody Guthrie, who was pictured a little bit in that movie, where the tragedy of it is you don't know, it doesn't present itself typically to you already had your childbearing years. So you may have had kids, and then those kids won't know. So they're sort of, and he had at least three children, two daughters who died, and his son, who became a very famous trendy singer, Arlo Guthrie, a couple of big hit songs, and one great song called Alice's Restaurant back in like 1967. And he never got, he's still around, 74 years old. So that is the tragedy of Huntington's disease, and it's classified by movement disorders. This is always, for you, it won't be a test question. If you go on with your careers, medicine or otherwise, it will be. It's called St. Vitus's dance. Okay, they used to think this was an affliction brought on by, God or the devil. And so when they saw people with this movement disorder, it was called St. Vitus's dance. Here's a little other nugget. For moldy rye bread, people used to have harsh visual communications because it was all they had to eat. It was called St. Anthony's fire. It was caused by ergotamines, which is the parent compound of lysergic acid diethylamide, known as LSD. St. Anthony's fire. Little bits of, it was afflictions brought on by the Almighty or the devil or whatever. So they named them that way. Little bits of useless information I'm a fountain of. Yeah, what was Mickey Mantle's batting average in 1956? It was 350. That type of stuff. Just saying. So here you can see what they look like. That's what they caused so they thought this had sort of like a striped appearance. That was I don't know if I buy that, but you can see the proximity to the ventricles. There they are. I'm so happy I got a chance to do that routine with the Sleeping Beauty and the Snow White. I do that with every class. It's all right. You're almost there to the Mr. Rogers story. We have a Mr. Rogers story. A real story. Remind me on web. Can you say thalamus? I know you can. Okay. Just saying, it's a Pittsburgh-based story. Right there, Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. That's where Fred, and he graduated of Rollins College down outside of Orlando. So thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus are the three major structures associated with the diencephalon. The oddball in that is bless you, is the limbic system. So we'll save the limbic system. So this is part of it. They're here. They're now, this is all cortex. Look at the size of it. Massive. So now we're here. So it's much, much smaller. So this is the thalamus, a round structure on the other side, identical, bilateral, and a little stalk that connects, or like intrathalamic adherence. And this is the hypothalamus. In the sheep, it's very tiny. This is the epithalamus or pineal gland. And again, when we get to endocrine, we really don't know what the pineal gland does other than make melatonin, which certainly assists us in sleeping, and it controls some degree of our daily rhythms. And we have rhythms that are annual, obviously monthly rhythms. So there's some input that they have there to sort of generically look. And you can see them in an actual specimen that's here. You can see the thalamus that's there, a little bit of hypothalamus, the tiny amount of, and you'll see the pineal, you'll see all these on the dissection. So 80% is the intrathalamic adhesion or mass. A lot of named nuclei you don't have to know, but they project and receive fibers. There's a lot of communication. I would almost call it subconscious processing. All of these, if you go on to graduate levels or medical school, you learn about all of these. You know, lateral geniculates are for vision, medial geniculates are for hearing, and blah, 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 and all these different nuclei that are there. Relay station, sorting, editing, impulses, now it plays a role. But the hypothalamus plays a role with the limbic system for emotion. So think of what happens, how you make yourself sick to your stomach over something. I had a big test, I know I'm going to fail it. And you find out you got a bad grade. It's like, ugh. Right? That's your emotions playing it on you. The cerebellum and basal nuclei, they augment motor, memory, and sensory integration. So it's important. So it mediates, is a good word, processes sensation, as well as how they interact with motor activities. They play a role. When you talk about cortical arousal, it's being awake and alert, learning and memory. We'll stop it here. We'll pick that up next time in lecture, and we'll sort of sidetrack, and we'll do the exams in lab. So thanks a lot. And thanks for putting up with my shtick.